Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to this Vigilant Software webinar on our vsRisk ISO 27001 risk assessment tool. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the Chief Executive of Vigilant Software, and I, for the next little while, will be talking to you about this product and dealing with any questions that you've got about how to use it and how it can operate effectively in your environment. I'm planning to give you a brief walk through the risk assessment wizard so you can see how easily and simply it deals with applying a risk assessment to an asset in the information security environment. But before I do that, a brief bit of background to how the tool came about for those of you who don't already know this. IT governance is and has been for some 7 or 8 years a leader in the world of information security and cybersecurity management. I set it up with a colleague, Steve Watkins, subsequent to our leading some years before that what turned out to be the world's first certification to the standard that came ahead of ISO 27001, which was BS 7799. And we learned in that process that putting together an assessment-ready information security management system from scratch was extremely challenging, and that led us to develop a series of tools and products which now form the heart of the range of items that are developed or sold within the broader IT governance group. I myself talk quite a lot about information security and cybersecurity. It's becoming increasingly a key issue for organizations, cybersecurity having made it into the UK press half a dozen times in no more than the last 3 or 4 days. And I certainly had an input into the original design of the vsRisk information security risk assessment tool and provide a continuing insight to the developers as they move on to develop future versions of it. And we have a development plan now in place which runs through to version 3. We're currently on version 1.6.5. So I'm briefly going to recap on the benefits of vsRisk and then give you a very quick run through the key operating capability of the tool, and then any questions that you have, commercial, technical, or anything else, very happy to deal with. You will all have noticed already that you're on mute. We found that that's quite a good way of ensuring background noise doesn't interfere with everybody else's listening and involvement in the webinar, but you can communicate with me and with my colleagues anytime simply by typing a message into the chat box, which sits over there probably on the right-hand side of your screen underneath the area which has got all of the guidance and tools. There's a chat box there. If you type a message in there, we'll get it, we'll see it, and we'll be able to respond. And certainly when you've got questions you want to ask about the tool and its deployment, that's probably the most practical way in which you can see that. You'll probably get the odd message here and there popping up around my screen, but that's just to prove that this is a live demonstration. I'm really here. This is not a pre-recorded thing being delivered by a robot. And then finally, we'll just run through the special offer which we've got available only today and tomorrow left in that offer. It expires at the end of February, but for those of you who see the benefit of vsRisk and want to take advantage of it, this will give an opportunity for you to do so. So a brief recap of the benefits of using vsRisk for an ISO 27001 risk assessment, and it is this. In an organization which has got more than 2 or 3 information assets, and where you need not only to do the risk assessment this year, but you need to be able to review it on a regular basis, and you need to be able to return to that risk assessment at least annually, and prior to that, whenever there is a major change in the risk environment, it simply makes practical sense to put the information assets into a database and to have an automated and standardized method of assessing risks to them. That process is made easier by the fact that there is a standard ISO 27005, which, apart from setting out a risk assessment methodology, and it's one which this tool follows, also contains a selection of threats and vulnerabilities, and you want to be able to access those freely and easily when doing a risk assessment, and that complete set of threats and vulnerabilities is included in this risk assessment tool. In simple terms, vsRisk is the only risk assessment tool that A, specifically follows the risk assessment methodology set out in ISO 27001, that's the specification for information security management, and follows the guidance of the supporting standard 27005, the guidance on risk assessment. Secondly, it's the only tool which can integrate out of the box into an ISO 27001 management system. It's designed to reflect issues like how you want to classify information and data. It's designed to produce core reports from the outset, core reports like the statement of applicability and risk treatment plan and so on. Thirdly, it's robust. In other words, you can rely on it to give you the same results for your assessment of risk year in and year out. And finally, it's targeted at a specific price range. Many risk assessment tools are only available for many thousands of pounds. There are not that many risk assessment tools. vsRisk is designed so that without its standard support contract, it costs marginally less than £1,000. The network-enabled version, which is the same piece of software that you'd install on a standalone basis, but enabled to export the database to a network server for central backup and control. It has some other benefits to it, is marginally substantially less, in fact, than £2,000. So it's priced to be a tool that can be afforded by the majority of organizations of any size, and it's priced at a level so that certainly for the standalone variant, it's no more than the cost of around about a day of a qualified information security consultant's time, and to use an external consultant to do a risk assessment without vsRisk would probably take something in the order of between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the size of your database. We'd expect vsRisk to roughly halve the total amount of time that a risk assessment takes. And it's that acceleration in the risk assessment process that is the major benefit inside a project of using vsRisk. It not only removes the challenge of having to work things out for yourself, removes the danger of going up dead ends and dead trees and so on, but it also ensures that you're able to be consistent in how you do the risk assessment over time. It eliminates all of the errors that you find working with spreadsheets, which is the traditional self-help approach to a risk assessment tool. It's create something on a spreadsheet. When you make changes in the spreadsheet, as you'll know if you've used spreadsheets before, you don't always pick those up in later versions, backup and so on. It tends not to be a very robust process. So vsRisk automates the process, accelerates it, integrates into your ISO 27001 management system, and produces the core documentation that you need. And because it produces it off of a database in a consistent way, you can produce a risk treatment plan, make a number of changes and amendments over time, and produce an updated risk treatment plan. Now, I'm going to give you the opportunity to fire questions at us, but before I do that, I want to just give, for those of you who may have taken the trial but not necessarily seen how straightforward the product is to use, a demonstration of the use of vsRisk. I hope that you can now see vsRisk open on the screen in front of you. Let me just give you a brief description of how it works. You've got on the left-hand side, a tab which lists all of the asset owners that you might have designated inside your information security management system. You can see from where my pointer is that in this case we've simply called the information security management system the ISMS demo. You give it whatever name you want, and in this particular case we've introduced 2 asset owners. I'm one of them, and there is a mythical Ms. Jane Doe who is for the moment the other asset owner. Adding asset owners is extremely straightforward. You simply right-click on the ISMS, you choose an asset owner, you select the name of the person that you want to add as an asset owner. In this case we'll make it John Doe, and John Doe is now added as an asset owner. Asset owners are people who, in ISO 27001, are responsible for the security of an asset. They don't, however, have the authority to sell it or do anything else like that. They have designated management responsibility for maintaining the security of an asset. That means at any time you can have a look at what assets a particular asset owner is responsible for, and you can drill down. We've got Ms. Jane Doe being responsible in this case simply for a client database, to the details of that database. It's relatively easy to add an asset to an asset owner, so you might decide that in this particular case you want Jane Doe to own a staff database as another version of an item. So that's going to fall into a specific group. I'll show you how to put groups in a minute, called databases. In this case, the type of asset is information database, and its staff data, you're going to want to put it at a high level of data classification, in this case what we call restricted data. And you'd simply save the details, and you now have another database added to that asset owner. The second group across the left-hand side are asset groups, and this enables you to create groups. You might want to create groups by types of assets. You might want to create groups by geographic location of those assets. You might want to look at all of the assets within an office in Caracas or in London or wherever it is, or you might want to look at it by asset types. In the version at the moment, what you see is that we have a set of groups here which simply look at asset types, databases, hardware, and of course vsRisk itself is an asset which we've listed in here as a specific asset. The third tab across the left-hand side is the administration tab. This is where you can type in the scope of the information security management system, which is here for reminder. You can type in your information security management policy and objectives. You can import and export here databases from elsewhere, perhaps from wherever you keep, perhaps from a configuration database or financial database where you've got a list of assets, and you can back up or restore the database. All of that's in this left-hand tab. Looking now at the process of doing an assessment, if you go to the top level set of tabs, you'll see that you've got four options. The one left from center is assessment. To be able to do an assessment, you have to choose an asset to do an assessment on. That's a requirement of ISO 27001. We'll choose staff database, in this case, as the asset that we want to do the assessment on, and that automatically opens up, as you see here, the screen for doing an assessment on that particular database. ISO 27001 says you need to take into account business, contractual, and legal issues when doing an assessment. Whether you choose to take those into account one by one, or whether you choose to do a composite risk assessment is a matter of your own risk assessment methodology. vsRisk is designed so that you can do either. We're going to look at the business availability of the staff database. You'd start off by selecting on the right-hand side here to edit this piece of information, and the first information you'll put in will be to look at the impact on the organization of losing that business asset. So you would have predefined your loss scale, and we're going to pretend for the sake of this demonstration that your scale is between a maximum loss on the left-hand side of £1,000 and a maximum loss on the right-hand side of £500,000, graded in between. So you're going to choose, you'd have written this down, part of your risk assessment methodology. You're going to choose a maximum potential loss of this database as being here at the £300,000 area. You put in here your justification for future reference. It's not a required screen, but you would put in there to know how you arrived at that decision about the impact of that potential loss. You can either save this data if you want to come back to it and do the risk assessment later, or you can simply continue into the risk assessment wizard, and that's what we'll do. The ISO 27001 says that you have to do a risk assessment following a very specific series of steps, and that is to define for each asset a threat, to identify the vulnerability that threat will exploit, to reckon the likelihood and impact of that threat exploiting that vulnerability, and on the basis of that to determine risk. vsRisk follows exactly that route. The first drop-down list you get is a set of potential threats. This includes, as choices, all of the threats which might be in ISO 27005. They're ordered obviously alphabetically, and as we're looking at the threat to the compromise of a client database, you'd be looking at information, you'd be looking at threats that might lead to that being compromised. So we're going to choose falsification of records as being the first threat that we want to have a look at. We're going to add that threat to the assessment, and we're then going to select the vulnerability from this drop-down screen on the right that the threat might exploit. That will then throw up a new screen which makes available again all of the vulnerabilities identified in ISO 27005, and you'll simply look for the vulnerability which you think that threat is most likely to exploit. Of course, I just say this, you can add threats and vulnerabilities. There's a tool in here which enables you to add your own threats and vulnerabilities, but mostly we find clients don't need to. We're going to choose as a vulnerability here inadequate anti-malware software. We'll say OK, that's a vulnerability, and we're going to say that the likelihood of this happening, of records being falsified because of the lack of anti-malware, is a 2. The risk assessment wizard then gives us a next, and you can see on the risk rating screen where the acceptable risk we selected is anything in the green box, that this particular risk sits in the level of acceptable risk. It's the level of unacceptable risk. It's outside of the green denominated area. So you therefore must select a control to apply to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. vsRisk is designed in this risk assessment wizard to take you through to do that. It gives you an opportunity to choose what controls you wish to add, and you do that simply by selecting from the Add Control screen. And here are listed all of the Annex A, ISO 27001 Annex A controls. Again, you can add controls in vsRisk if you wish to add custom controls, but as Annex A is the minimum set of controls you have to consider, that's where the tool starts. You can select the control that you think is most likely to reduce the likelihood of the database being compromised. We'll choose confidentiality agreements in this case. And because your risk assessment has to produce a statement of applicability that contains both current and future controls, you can determine when you're doing the risk assessment whether the control you select is one that's already in place or one that has to be input. In this case, confidentiality agreement we will pretend is not a control you have in place. So as you can see, it's a planned control. We've got a planned control date in here, which we want to put somewhere in the future. So we'll choose the 22nd of March. You've determined that's by when you'll have it implemented. That takes you through to next, and you've determined that that will reduce the impact to a 2. Having made that choice, you then go back to the risk rating, and you can see that the application of that control has reduced risk to within your level of what's an acceptable risk. It's showing as a risk level 3, and that risk level 3 you've predetermined as being an acceptable risk. So you can move on now either to select an additional control. You might, for instance, wish to select a control that's already in place because you want to complete your statement of applicability, and in this case we'll assume that the information security policy document is in place. It's a current control, so it doesn't need a target date. You're going to select next. There'll be no changed impact and likelihood because that control is already in place, and therefore the risk rating hasn't changed, and you can then reviewing which risks, which controls you've selected, close the risk assessment wizard. You then see for that asset the current status. You can see as you look across the threat vulnerability combination, threat placed above vulnerability, that you started off with a risk rating of 4, that the application of controls has reduced the residual rating, the remaining risk in there, to a level of 3. It's shown as green because that's your level of acceptable risk, and that's your job done in terms of that particular asset. You can then repeat the process for each of the assets, and we normally recommend that where you have a number of assets of a similar type, for instance, or laptops, you treat them, assuming that they're all facing similar threats and vulnerabilities, as being essentially a single asset. You might treat maybe finance laptops as a separate asset to salespeople laptop, for instance, but you treat a group of assets as an asset and do the risk assessment on that basis. Because it's a tool for doing an information security management system risk assessment, it also needs to be capable of being audited. This particular screen here, the history screen, will tell you a decent set of details of any changes that have taken place. You can look at changes to audits for a particular asset between a particular set of dates very easily. And finally, you have a set of screens here for your reports. All of these are reports with the exception of comments, which are required by ISO 27001. It's the statement of applicability which is the critical document. You can produce it simply by hitting launch. Again, there is a statement of applicability report wizard. What you do is you can select a classification for the report. Usually you'd select a classification based on the most sensitive data that you're reporting on. In this case, it happens to be restricted. You could choose some other classification if you want to, but we're staying here with restricted. It's a requirement of ISO 27001 that where you don't select a control, you must include the justification, but you can choose to, for a first pass, not include the justification, and you can produce it at whatever version, and the version numbering will be collected, will be produced by the tool. We're going to produce a part version because we don't have that many assets in here. My screen has got some latency, so we'll simply run on and produce the report. It will take a couple of minutes to put itself together because it has to compose inside vsRisk. And there it is. That's, as you can see, we made for the ISMS demo. Here we start on the controls that we selected, and you can see from the screen that the selected control starts with the information security policy. It tells you which control has been applied, and it tells you which laptops they've been applied to. Information security policy review has been selected as a future control, which is why it shows, review of information security policy hasn't been selected as a control, which is why it shows as no here. And the statement of applicability will run through all of the controls, none of which, as you can see, we've only done a risk assessment for a limited number of items. None of them have been selected. So there you have it. That's as simple, and you can obviously print this out to PDF or any other format to paper that you want to, and you print out and retain a version-controlled copy of it for as a core part of your ISMS documentation. So I'll close that right now, return ourselves to the asset group screen and to the assessment screen where we can see the availability area, and stop brief demonstration I was planning to do, and therefore open it up for people who have questions about the use of the tool or anything like that. Please do feel free to type in, using your chat screen, a question that you'd like me to answer. And what I'll do with any questions that you've got is we'll share the question with everybody, and then I'll tell you what the answer is. So I'm perfectly happy for technical questions, questions about how to use the tool in risk assessment, its role, any of those kind of issues. Please feel free to share questions with me. And the silence you get here is just me giving you the opportunity to fire up any particular questions that you want. There's a question from one of our delegates. Does vsRisk run on Macs? At this time, no. vsRisk is designed to run on Microsoft environments. At the point that we were designing vsRisk, Mac wasn't a widely enough used tool to be useful for information security risk managers in most of the environments we're operating in. That's changed over the last relatively short space of time. Macs are still not that often used in our target client environments, but because they are, we now have a Mac version which is under development. No, at the moment an app version isn't planned. There is a development path which goes from the network-enabled version now to a fully multi-user version which will have multi-screen and plug-in capability to a number of other tools, which will be version 2. Version 3 will have an online option. The product development pathway logic is that it should be possible for an organization to start with a standalone version of the product, to use that in a particular environment, upgrade to the network version at a later point, or indeed to transfer if they need to into the cloud environment. So that upgrade path we have under development, but there is not an app version. This is a database-based tool which is designed to be backed up and used as a key part of the information security infrastructure. We expect a Mac version to be available before the turn of this year. Our prime development route is built around the multi-user version and then the cloud version, with Mac coming through as a secondary item to that. Depending on client feedback, we might accelerate it, but at the moment we're not expecting to see a Mac version out much before the end of 2013. We expect to see the network-enabled version out by September. We have version 1.7 due for launch in April, and as I say, version 2, which is the fully multi-user version, we expect to see that out by September is the current start target date. So I have a question here. Let me just make sure I can see it. So the question is, how come you have impact reducing when you choose to apply the control on falsification of records? I expect only the likelihood to be reduced. Yes, that's exactly correct. I was just simply choosing at random. You're correct. That specific control would reduce likelihood, and that's the correct application. You reduce impact on falsification of database primarily by looking at options like backup. That might be an appropriate control to reduce the impact of the compromise of the data. So that's good. I like it when delegates are paying attention to the detail. It means that you know exactly how you can go about using this tool in your own environments to get where you need to get to. Other questions, folks, that you'd like to pose to me, either through the question section or through the chat section? All right, so if you're just thinking about your questions, we can go back to vsRisk at any time that you want to. I just want to start you thinking about getting your own copy of vsRisk and deploying it in your own environment. Anybody specifically on this webinar who wants to access the special offer we have a standard upgrade and support package with both the standalone version and the network variant, which is worth around about £150 on the standalone version and about £250 on the network version. We're providing those, and that comes with a year's worth of cover for upgrades, for network support, for any of those kind of standard issues that you might want to. We're providing a year of free service and support package for anybody purchasing either a standalone or a network-enabled variant of vsRisk, provided that the purchase comes through before close of business UK time. That's 5 o'clock GMT tomorrow afternoon, Thursday the 28th of February, and the way you access it is to email Service Central Vigilant Software. The email address is now on the screen right there, or telephone us 0845 003 8228. If you're outside the UK, it would be international code and then 44 845 003 8228, and quote the vsRisk Trialist Webinar offer to be able to access that one-off February only full update and support package. And it's worth having because with version 1.7 and other versions coming out, and potentially version 2, to be able to access those kind of improvements as part of your initial package, plus having access to solid service and support team, is a thoroughly worthwhile part of what you're doing. The overall benefits, of course, of vsRisk isn't just in the support package, it's in the fact that it will accelerate your ISO 27001 project. It will give you a information security management system which is robust and which an outside auditor is able to assess. And we've now sold probably 500 copies of vsRisk to organizations around the world, so more and more certification bodies are becoming used to seeing vsRisk in the work environment. We've helped coming up for 150 organizations. Our parent company, IT Governance, has helped about 150 organizations achieve ISO 27001 certification, the vast majority of whom have used vsRisk as part of their method of tackling ISMS compliance. So a product that's well established, worthwhile having, easy to deploy, easy to use, and as long as you take action between now and tomorrow night, comes with its first year of service and support built into the base price. The base price is, for the standalone version, £995, and for the network-enabled version, I believe, is £1,295. So that's the kind of price you'd be paying to get the product plus the fully featured, the full service and support package. Folks, that brings me to the end of what I was planning to say. I'm very happy if, sorry, I have a do you get policy, I missed a question, right, so how do you get ISM policy A 5.1.1 to reflect in all your assets? It's very straightforward to reflect a policy across all of the assets. What you do is you choose the asset group, let us say databases, and you do the assessment at, as you can see in the screen, you do the assessment at the group level. So it's very easy to choose a policy and apply it to the whole of that particular group. It's rare that organizations want to apply a policy across the whole of the ISMS, so this is focused at the group assessment view. And this means once you put it in here that all other assets that you add to this group will inherit any controls that you've applied at that group level. I hope I haven't missed any other questions, folks. No, I think that's probably it then. So just reiterate, if there are questions arising after this webinar that you want to go through, please do also email us, Service Center at Vigilant Software. We can arrange to answer those questions directly. If there's something specific you want to talk about in terms of deployment of vsRisk in your own environment, email us or telephone us to talk directly to the Vigilant Software support team, and we can enable you to get and deploy vsRisk in your own environment. So just stress again, special value, worthwhile having service and support policy, but I'll just at this point say thank you all for having been on here today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you.